here we are in the Greater Tkaronto Bioregion, the GTB. It's no longer the GTA. We're the cool kids. It's the GTB, right? And we are on the north shore of Lake Ontario, part of the Great Lakes Basin, which of course holds 20% of the world's fresh water. That's a big deal. The GTB is very generally bounded by the Niagara Escarpment on the west, Oak Ridges Moraine along with Lake Simcoe to the north, Oak Ridges Moraine on the east, and then Lake Ontario to the south. We're talking 1.25 million hectares, 8 million people. So this is a big bioregion. 7th generation GTB reflects the work of the Honorable David Crombie and the seminal 1992 regeneration report that he did. And Mr. Crombie is actually an ambassador for 7th generation GTB, and we're great to have his elder voice as part of the legacy chain in this work. 7th generation GTB is about social regeneration, generations in community, going hand in hand with ecological regeneration, community in bioregion, because you need both. A lot of times we think we can fix the natural world, but if you can't fix the natural world without also looking at the people who are in relationship with that natural world. So we're taking a very holistic, relationship-based approach. As part of 7th generation GTB, we're looking to create a bioregional learning center, and this is the first convening to start to shape what that bioregional learning can look like. There will be a place eventually, but there will also be a decentralized network, depending very much on schools and libraries, to spread information and education and opportunities deep into every community and reach every family through every child. So we have a big, broad vision to give people both the knowledge and the skills to live in a changing world. And that's what we're going to start to explore today. The Legacy Project is about big picture, long-term thinking. We talk about lifetimes across generations. And as we set the context and intention for today, I want to start with the voices of the young people in the room. We're very lucky to have two students here. They happen to be brother and sister, Siobhan Bonerath and Ethan Bonerath. And we're very happy they are two of the student eco leaders. We will be starting with 40 schools in the fall, and they are two of our student eco leaders. Ethan has actually been working with us for a couple of years. Heading off to McMaster, but he's going to lead the university portion of the student contingent. So I would like to turn it over to them so that we can hear their voices to set the context for the work today.
Hello, I'm Siobhan, and I'm so excited to be here today. I'm excited to share, listen, and learn, because that's what we're here for, to make the world a better place. One thing I've been pondering about recently is what we're striving for is to make a better place, but that also means making change and sacrifices, both of which are difficult for many. I look out my window and see smoke in the sky, and I know that's because of the raging forest fires, because of our ever-heating climate. I'm only brushing the surface of what forest fires mean for us and what caused them. Nonetheless, it makes me uncomfortable. It reminds me that the world that we live in has to change, and I want to be best prepared and comfortable when it does. When working to change and better the planet, we also have to look inside ourselves and be willing for that change. Change is hard no matter what aspect of your life it is. We've all had change disrupt our sense of self plenty of times in our life. Whether that's starting a new school, an ill family member, learning to drive, or even being here today. I become overwhelmed at the thought of every aspect of my life and the world I live in changing. However, when you are aware of the changes to come is when the anxiety starts gnawing, at least for me. Our lives right now are pretty great, and so much of our comfort we take for granted. For me, it's a scary thought for some of my comfort and privileges to be taken away, even if I'm educated on the fact that my privileges are destroying the world that I love. That's why the people who are ignorant will most definitely not be willing to give up their comfortable way of life. I'm not saying that saving this beautiful planet is going to make our lives worse, just different, in a way that none of us can anticipate or understand. At least I know I can't, and that's scary. Personally, I have a great deal to learn about what environmental education even is and what it means for a person. It's important to be informed about what's going on in the world to make sure you have your own judgments on how you personally feel. Not only how someone prompted you to feel about it, with how they shared the information. That's something I'm still learning. When you know so little about something, everything you know about it is new. Therefore, it's the only perspective you have on it. That's why it's crucial to learn the same thing through different perspectives, not only to have a better understanding, but also your own opinion. When learning things through school, I found it's easier to make my own opinion than it is to learn the same thing through social media. I believe that's because people are learning alongside me. We learn and we share together. We all have our own personal experiences along with identities, which lead us to take and learn different information and things from the same stuff we're being taught. Being open-minded to different perspectives is vital when trying to fix or solve anything, especially when it comes to the land. Colonizer history has shadowed many different views and perspectives, and it's our job to bring out those shadowed voices to learn better as a community. One very important but shadowed voice here in Canada is the voice of the Indigenous peoples. Their knowledge is very important if we're talking about a bioregional learning center in our local area. Not only can their voices be important geographically, but their perspectives will also help us learn what our next steps on our multicultural, multi-generational journey. There's so much to learn, and I'm excited for the lifelong learning journey I will embark on. Thank you all for being here, and with that, I will leave it over to my brother.
Hello, I'm Ethan Bonerath. I'm a recent high school graduate and will be going to McMaster University next year for health science. Climate anxiety is a rising challenge many people, especially youth, are facing today. Seeing record heat levels, loss of many animal species, and increasing occurrence of natural disaster can affect many people's mental health. Some people have decided not to have children because they're worried about the future conditions. They're worried about overpopulation. But then other people say, like Elon Musk, that we need to have more children for population collapse. So how do we make our decisions, and how do we get through all of the different ideas in the media? Our exceeding planetary boundaries are real, whether we want to believe them or not. So do we take action, or do we just live our comfortable lives? How can we make a difference? We need to talk deeply about the challenges we face and the world we want to live in. We need to take action, improve our local waterways and our biodiversity. I grew up in an intergenerational household, living with my great-grandmother and learning from her. That's why I believe intergenerational connections are such an important part of taking action. Older generations have knowledge and wisdom that younger generations don't yet have, and younger generations have innovative ideas and are more attuned to the changing world. By bringing people of all ages together, we can talk, and we can benefit from vast perspectives and experience to create new ideas, and create intelligence and learning that is greater than the sum of its parts. Teaching children how to critically think is also vital. Youth need to speak up and be able to think critically about the world and complex challenges we are currently facing and new challenges we will face. I found in my public school education, I spend more time listening to others than creating my own thoughts. Children need to know that their voices are valued, whether they're right or wrong, because their ideas are what will shape the future. Children need to talk through their climate anxiety and understand that their voices and actions will make a difference, one step at a time. I hosted an intergenerational climate event at my high school, where students and older adults came together to listen to Joe Brewer about bioregions and the climate crisis. We need to heal the earth and prevent further damage from occurring, and take opportunities like this to learn from each other and with each other. We need to touch the grass again. We need to get in touch with the environment. We have for too long taken nature for granted. We are not separate from nature, but we are a part of nature. What does it mean to be a good steward of the land and a good ancestor for future generations? Do we want our great-grandchildren to know the same plants, animals, and beautiful world that we knew? Our collective global aim should be to make the world greater, better, and more beautiful than we found it. Thank you.
Now we have somebody who has come all the way from Colombia to be here with us. And Joe Brewer, I'm pleased to say, is a friend. We've gotten to know him very well as we've worked with him over the last year. He has a background in both earth system science and cognitive science, so he's well aware of how we have to bring together the social and ecological regeneration. He is author of the Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. He and Penny are co-founders of the Design School for Regenerating Earth. And they both live in Barichara, Colombia, are helping to regenerate 500,000 hectares of land. So he's got his hands in the soil every day. I see photos on Twitter that prove that he's in there every day. So he has, I think, a thoughtful and provocative presentation. So I'd like to hand the floor over to Joe Brewer.
I want to start by honoring the children, by saying, just like Ruben, my primary source of legitimacy today is not any academic credentials, although I have a few of those. It's that I have a 6-year-old daughter. And knowing what I know about the state of the world, choosing to have a child, knowing how difficult of a choice that is, means I'm fully committed to humanity sticking around in this little menagerie of the planet. What I want to do today is share with you what's important to me, so it'll be in a little bit more elaborated form. And I want to start by reminding us that while climate change is part of a very distorted and myopic policy discourse of the world that blinds us to almost all of the deep systemic issues by making us think that CO2 levels in the atmosphere is the only problem. There's a huge, huge conversation we can have about how to actually talk about the planet. But one thing to get us started is something that I talked about when I was here back in February. So those of you who saw the talks that I gave will know about the planetary boundaries, which is a framework developed by 3,500 Earth system scientists through a period of about 15 years of asking a fundamental question. Are there any thresholds of the planet that if we crossed them, our ability to have a Holocene-like warm, stable climate, which is the only context we know of for having a globalized civilization, or any kind of civilization for that matter, that is gone if we cross any one of these thresholds. And as these numbers indicate, in 2015, they found that we had crossed 4. In 2021, they confirmed we'd crossed 2 more. In 2022, we crossed another. So 7 of 9, where if you cross only 1, civilizations probably won't exist for much longer. And so climate change is here, but then there's biosphere integrity, which is mass extinction or the loss of biodiversity. Land system change, which is a major driver of all of the other problems. Freshwater use. There's only 1% of the world's water is freshwater, and most of the world's freshwater is contaminated or is being lost in various ways. Biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus associated with synthetic fertilizers, creating dead zones at the mouths of all the world's major rivers. Ocean acidification causing coral reefs to go away by mid-century. Atmospheric aerosol loading or air pollution. Stratospheric ozone depletion, which is the protective layer from ultraviolet radiation for all land-based organisms. And novel entities, which in this case is microplastics, which are now in the breast milk of every woman on Earth. And so when we look at this and go, we're beyond anything remotely close to sustainability. And reducing the whole conversation to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a really tragic joke. The truth is that we're already in a place of tremendous transformation and change. And so the question that I'd like to guide our conversation today is, what is the role and what is the expression of education in the context of planetary breakdown? Because it's already happening. We actually crossed the carrying capacity for humans around the time I was born in the mid-1970s. And so just look at the material flows of the ecological footprint as your standard measure, although there are others, that we've exceeded the natural regenerative capacities of the planet before a lot of us in this room were even born. And so we're living through a multi-generational process that's actually happening very quickly. And what I want to do is give us a context to ask the question, what is learning all about in a time like this? And so when we go into a situation that is so serious and so deep, it's helpful to see a little bit of what are the changes we can anticipate in the lifetimes of our young people. And I'm not going to be exhaustive, but I want to give a couple examples. And so one example is that if you look at the research on tipping points in the climate system, you'll see there are a whole bunch of them. And those of you who pay attention to social systems will notice food prices, peak oil, instability, water conflicts, all kinds of things that are in human systems are not studied by climate scientists, so they're not included here. But if you just look at the tipping points of the Earth system, like the boreal forest around the Arctic Circle, the world's largest forest system, which could die back, the Amazon rainforest, which is in the process of collapsing now, the ocean circulation, what's called the thermohaline circulation of the world ocean, the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, the permafrost in the northern lands in the Arctic Circle that are melting, releasing methane, the coral reefs that are collapsing due to bleaching and ocean acidification, the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is accelerating its collapse now. And you can see things like anywhere between 5 and 20 meters of sea level rise built into these tipping points with huge amounts of uncertainties about when they might occur, all of them progressing and some of them already crossed. And so when we're in a context that is so deeply interdependent with so much systemic risk, we have to have really, really good ways of building systemic resilience. And so let's just look at a few of these. For example, simple feedback loop is this one. Global warming in the Arctic causes the Arctic Ocean to get warmer, which means that there's less ice, which means there's more absorption of sunlight into the world ocean, because dark blue ocean absorbs about 90% of the sunlight, whereas ice on the Arctic Ocean reflects away about 90% of sunlight, and you get a positive feedback loop. So we get these feedback loops like this. And so what happens when there's no more ice in the Arctic Ocean? What's called the Blue Ocean Event, which is scheduled right now sometime to occur between about 2026 and 2030. But things keep appearing faster than scheduled. So the question is, what happens to all of the world's weather patterns when you change something as significant as the great reflector at the top of the planet becoming the great absorber, when our weather patterns are driven by vibrational patterns like rubber bands circling the Earth, these things called jet streams, which are anchored to our ocean temperatures, in particular the surface temperatures of the ocean. So what happens to all of the world's weather when there's no more ice in the Arctic during the Northern Hemisphere's summer? These are things that we need to think about when we think about education. Or what happens when the Greenland ice sheet melts, causing sea level to rise by up to 7 meters? What does that do when more than half of the human population lives along coastlines in cities? And so I think of things like this, or like the methane release, where right now there are huge craters exploding in the Siberian tundra, as frozen vegetation. The beautiful thing about frozen vegetation is bacteria cannot metabolize, which means the vegetation stays frozen. You basically have undigested vegetation. And as it melts, it activates microorganisms to begin decomposing it, releasing huge amounts of methane that could actually cause, within a period of about 10 years, a significant leap in planetary temperature of the world's atmosphere. And this is something that's happening now. This is also important to know it's in the Arctic, where we already expect 5 to 10 times as much warming in the Arctic as at the equator, which will dramatically change the mixing of heat throughout the whole planet, changing all of our weather systems. And so it's in contexts like this, we need to ask, what are the next 50 years going to look like, and what do our kids need to be prepared for? Or if you look at the dieback of the Great Boreal Forest, a lot of people don't know that there's this ring of forest in the Northern Hemisphere that's twice as large as the Amazon. It's the world's largest forest. In 2016, the Amazon went from being a net absorber of carbon dioxide to being a net emitter. So now the Amazon rainforest increases global warming because of patterns of deforestation. The boreal forests haven't done that yet. But what do you think this is? This is the beginning of the dieback of the great boreal forest. So when we hear about these wildfires and we don't know about the Earth system and how it works, this is going to accelerate and amplify the warming in the Arctic, increasing the drying out of the boreal forest, causing it to die back even more quickly. And so these patterns that are already happening now are going to have consequences indefinitely into the future. So when we're thinking about education, in a moment like this is a map of wildfires from a couple weeks ago. Right? I think all of you are breathing this smoke. I think I'm breathing the smoke right now. And so when we look at things like this, or how the melting of the Greenland ice sheet can cause the ocean's mixing processes, this great conveyor belt, to stop, and it's actually reduced by 15% between 1980 and about 2010. And so it's looking like it could stop anytime in the next decade, causing all of our monsoon systems and our weather systems to become completely erratic. What do we think is going to happen to agriculture when that occurs? I think you can guess. And so it's in this kind of a situation, with the El Nino and La Nina also doing their thing. These are all connected. All of these different patterns are connected. And our education systems have done a really bad job of teaching us interdependence, especially about the planet, which is what we need to know more than anything else. How does the Earth work? How do these relationships work? And when we look at this, we can start to see that we need to ask big questions. Questions that are bigger than any questions we've asked before, because we are in uncharted territory. And if we want to have a future as a species within this planet and all of its complexity, we have to find a place for ourselves. And the word that I want to emphasize in that sentence is place. We have to find a place for ourselves, a place in which to participate in the relationships that affect us from that place and that are affecting other places. So I come here today to talk about bioregional learning centers in the Greater Tkaronto Bioregion, but I can't do that without placing this bioregion in its context. You are in the Great Lakes. You are in the largest basin of fresh water on Earth. 21% of the world's water, more water than all 200 rivers that drain into the Amazon. Just half of the continent of South America. There's more water here in these lakes. What does it even mean to regenerate the Great Lakes? Have you ever asked yourself that question? I'm guessing almost no one has asked, what is the regeneration of the Great Lakes? How are the Great Lakes a living system? How do they function as a living system? You might think of things like fish in the lakes, right? You might think of things like the health of the aquatic ecosystems, but this is a continental scale system. The Great Lakes are a big part of an entire continent. And so, if we're going to ask what will it take to regenerate the Great Lakes, we have to ask really different kinds of questions than we have been taught to ask before. For example, where's the human population on this continent? This is a density map of human population. All right, with all of those things we were just seeing in the Earth system, where will all of those people go when sea level rises or when there are really nasty hurricanes or other things that can cause disruptions? Where are all those people going to go? Where is their water? You see, the Great Lakes as a living system includes the dynamics of humans and human economies. So if we ask, what does it mean to regenerate the Great Lakes, we have to ask ourselves, what happens when there's mass migrations of displaced people due to climate change, food system collapse, conflict, whatever the causes may be, because there are going to be many causes. And when you look at the population density of this continent, you might notice over here it's a lot drier and a lot more sparse. And over here, We've done a pretty good job of deforesting it. We've done a pretty good job of industrializing it. We've done a pretty good job of turning the biomass of this side of the continent into humans. And now there are a lot of humans in the living systems of the Great Lakes. So to regenerate the Great Lakes has a big focus on the humans. How do humans organize themselves into these landscapes? And you can already see that the way we do education now, which is mostly, unfortunately, how to get a job for a corporation somewhere. Right, that's still what mostly education is about. Get your degree to get a job to go work for some corporate entity. Could be a nonprofit corporate entity, could be a governmental corporate entity, or it could be a for-profit corporate entity. But it's mostly how do you become a cog in the machine of corporatism, because that's what most of our global economy has become. But what does it mean to not be a cog in the machine? Thank you, Jem, for bringing that up. We need to change that way of thinking. What does it mean to be a living relational dynamic within the web of life where you live? And so we need to look at these things like population density. Or this is the flow of freight through the Great Lakes. Thinking of the Great Lakes as a giant living system of human economic activity, and just noticing how it's not just the Algonquin peoples who had their canoes going across these lakes. We settler culture folks like to move our canoes across these lakes too. And so the Great Lakes have become a massive system of consumption, of manufacturing, of transport, huge, huge thermodynamic system of moving things around for human economies. If you were to overlay this with the migration patterns of birds, the fly between North and South America, or the migration patterns of mammals, or the movements of fish, or the fact that all these lakes connect to the ocean, and you start to see the Great Lakes in a different way. You start to see that this place is connected to a much more powerful system, a huge, powerful, leverageable, relatable system that we can work with. And then when you think of the Great Lakes as an economy, it's really interesting. Going back to the early history of the bioregionalism movement in the 1960s, and this time called the Back to the Land movement, where people were wanting to rebel against nation states. So let's just imagine for a second, if the Great Lakes was a country, if the US and Canada went away, if we stopped pretending there was this synthetic fiction called a national border and looked at this system as it really is, if the Great Lakes was a country, measured in GDP, which is a hugely faulty and dysfunctional measure, because all GDP tells you is when money changes hands for buying goods and services. So a mother breastfeeding her child has no value in GDP. So GDP is a really distorted measure, but $6 trillion in US dollars per year, 107 million inhabitants, human inhabitants. If you include non-humans, it's a lot more. If the Great Lakes was a country, it'd be the third largest economy in the world, after the United States and China. And so it's really interesting to see how you are already part of one of the world's most powerful economies, already part of one of the most impactful and therefore harmful economies, because our global economy is innately and intricately unsustainable. The whole economy has to collapse and go away for us to build another one in its place. And yet you sit in the middle of one of the most powerful economies on earth. It's such a weird thing to say the United States is the most powerful economy. The United States is a political fiction. This is a real network of transport and production, already organized with international treaties for a huge amount of exchange across the national borders. And so when the nation states fail, because by the way, nation states haven't been around very long, 90% of the nations in the world are less than 100 years old. They're not going to last very much longer. What's going to come later? What's going to come after them? What are we preparing our children for? We need to prepare them to live in economies organized around their landscapes, and you've got a pretty powerful landscape to organize an economy around. I mean, you've got Chicago, you've got all of Michigan, you got a good chunk of New York, you got all this area, all these economies that are part of this living system. And mostly they don't know it, because we don't think of ourselves as embedded in landscapes, at least not collectively. And so it's in this way that we can start to look at the Greater Tkaronto Bioregion. And we could say, what is education here? As Susan was saying, you've got the Oak Ridges Moraine and the Greenbelt, which roughly corresponds with it. Right, you've got structures here. You've got this concentration of water that is just incredible. It's in this region. And so when you start to look closer to your place here on the north shores of Lake Ontario, you can start to see that you're connected. You're like a fractal embedded within the larger Great Lakes system, which is then like a fractal again embedded within a larger network of basins of the continent, and also with weather patterns and migratory patterns that all move through this place. And so when we try and ask ourselves, what is education in a place like this, where you have these dense, highly unsustainable urban areas, lots of people focusing on urban sustainability, even though there's zero examples of sustainable cities in all of history. But we've got to do what we can about the supply chains connected to them. And then this vast landscape above it to the north with huge productive capabilities that is increasingly being degraded and that needs to be cared for, protected, and restored to its natural capacities. And so you can start to feel that education may have something to do with learning how to relate to this landscape, right? Because see, the geology of this region is completely unique. There's nothing like the Oak Ridges Moraine or the Niagara Escarpment. There's nothing like this drainage from one lake to another of such epic proportions. This is a really incredible place with a fairly temperate climate. Even though I know it gets pretty cold here in the winter, you guys have a pretty good growing season. You've got lots of alluvial plains. You've got lots of nutrients that can be replenished in your soils. Lots of capacity for forest ecosystems that can be the basis for a different kind of economy. But people have to learn how to live within that different kind of economy. And so a question I would ask is, how can this region lead the way in bringing regeneration to the rest of the Great Lakes? How can you take the great strengths you have with things like your conservation authorities, things like the Rouge National Park, things like the Oak Ridges Moraine that are here, that aren't going away, and that can really organize around a very different way of building an economy, which is grounded in a very different way of living into relationships. And so it's all about education. And so something that we're doing at the Design School for Regenerating Earth is we're weaving a process of bioregional activations that actually started as a little test round in the Central Rockies in Colorado, and then had a little bit bigger expression in January and February here in the Great Lakes when we came through the Toronto area into upstate New York and into northeastern Ohio. And then later in June, we did a tour of the Colorado Basin, connecting people around the regeneration of all of the Colorado Basin from headwaters to the Sea of Cortez. In October, we're going to do a really big activation tour in Cascadia on connecting about 20 different cities around a vision of the 450 watersheds of the Cascade Mountain Range and the Salish Sea. And what we're seeing everywhere we go is that there is a story of connection that people are ready to step into. There's a story of my community can work with that community, can work with that community, because we're all in this together. What are we in together? A holistic landscape. A holistic landscape that we need to live within in the right relationships to our place. And so, this is just to bring us back to the really important concept for those of you who may not have heard it before. Like, we've been talking about bioregional learning centers, but what is a bioregion? So just take this as a basic concept. I'm not going to elaborate because we'll have plenty of time for discussion. But simply, the word bioregion, biological region, shortened, it's the context for the whole life system of a population for any species of any organism. So you have a bioregion for starfish, you have a bioregion for bumblebees. It is the geographic context for the entire life system of the species in that place. For humans, a bioregion is interestingly complex because we have our physical material needs connected to the ecology of place, but then we also have cultural identity, types of technology and social organization, and different ways of expressing ourselves, all of which can change the boundaries of our biological regions. Right now, our bioregion is global supply chains causing the biosphere of the Earth to collapse. So you could say the human biosphere is an interconnected web at a planetary scale that is poorly configured to life. Whereas if you look at 99% of human history, ancestral indigenous landscapes, human cultures did find sustainability very frequently by organizing themselves within territories, within regional landscapes and trade networks, which is what our cultural history and our biological history as a species shows us. Which means a big part of our education is to relearn and to unlearn what it means to be human in place. There's a huge role for education about what it means to be human. And one thing about being human, at least for 99% of human history, is to have our cultural identities connected to a place. So we could be the bear people or the salmon people, right? We could be the people of iconic totemic relationships and to specific ecosystems and to the depth of place, which invites us into a reimagination of education. And so the way that we address our planetary predicament is to recognize that a bioregion, by definition, is the whole system for life. If it's a whole system for life, then a bioregion becomes the model or the representation for how you design your way back into harmony with the rest of life, is you reintegrate human relationships with the life systems that we depend upon. And so this opens up a really interesting possibility, which is to create a planetary network of bioregions for each of us in each place to learn how to live into our places and have other places on different parts of the planet that we can collaborate with because they have similarities of culture, similarities of ecology, similarities of economic capacity, and that we can learn from each other and learn together. And so the basic idea is this. If you look at the Earth as types of ecosystems, which is what this map shows, it's not important what each color represents. It's only important that each color represents a particular kind of soil, a particular kind of ecosystem, a particular kind of climate. And if you look around the Earth, you'll see there are a whole bunch of them, which means we should expect cultural diversity for the humans living in these different places. The kind of economy here in this purple should be different from that economy there that's yellow, because they are integrated into the kind of ecology of their place. This is what's called traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous wisdom, ancestral practices. All that stuff is referring to the fact that human cultures co-evolve with their landscapes. And so what we need to do is recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of material flows and social relationships. And that means we need to evolve our local culture and our local economic systems to be adapted to the place we are, and to restore the natural living systems capacities, which are the capacities to regenerate, such as the Oak Ridges moraine, which every time there's precipitation, it regenerates the water supply. Right? You have these natural regenerative processes, and you integrate your local economy and your local culture with them. And this should be obvious. This is so different from changing your light bulbs. Right? This is so different from turning from an internal combustion engine to an electric car that has to mine the seafloor to get its lithium. Right? This is about learning to live in the material flows of your place, which is a really deep remembering of what it means to be human. So there are implications all over the place about what this says for education. And so I just want to define bioregional learning centers in the way it was developed by a particular group of people in the 1980s, the Balaton group, named after Lake Balaton in Hungary. This was a group called the Club of Rome that had commissioned a study in the early 1970s, a computer simulation of the material flows of the global economy, a study famously called Limits to Growth, where they showed that on the business as usual trajectory, that's where the phrase business as usual comes from, is that computer simulation, that the collapse patterns we're experiencing today are exactly what they forecast, even though they were not predicting the future. And so for the next 10 years, they gathered at universities and different think tanks all around the world. They asked all kinds of questions. How do we get to planetary sustainability? And this is what came out. In 1983, they said this. So 40 years ago. Said each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each region. Now, doesn't that tell you one way of framing the purpose of education is to develop the local capacity to work with the cultural and ecological endowments of place to build a sustainable economy? This should be the purpose of education, according to this group. And then Dana Meadows, who is the lead author of that study, literally wrote the book Systems Thinking. She said, out of this 10 years of meetings and conversations came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. What they called for at that time was what we've now done with our universities, where we have these beautiful modeling research centers for things like lakes and rivers, right? These things that are place-based, to be connected with local knowledge of ecology, to be connected with local lifeways, to be connected to the development of a local or regional economy. This was the best way to get to planetary sustainability, circa 1983, and no better idea has been presented since, because no better idea exists. The only way to get to planetary sustainability is to return within the harmony of landscapes at local and regional scales all over the planet. And so this gets to the idea of bioregional learning centers. A bioregional learning center is the amalgamation of learning connected to a place that goes to everything from what is this little plant here and can I use it to make medicine, all the way through to our most advanced computing and modeling simulation studies at universities and laboratories, and putting all of them together in service to how to live in harmony with our places. And so one of the ideas is that when you start thinking about a bioregional learning center, you quickly start to realize it's connected to everything, which might make it seem mushy. Like, how could it be connected to everything? And the answer is because it's systemic. That's all, it's systemic. It's recognizing that everything is already connected to everything else. So you care about community and the environment and the economy and health. You care about indigenous ways of knowing. Like you have on and on, it's all connected. But the important thing is that the complexity is held by the natural organizing of place. The place, the landscape, the region holds a tremendous amount of complexity. So a lot of education becomes, well, what is the complexity of our place? What is the uniqueness of our place? What is the personality of our place? What is sacred that only exists in our place? And how do we relate to it well? And so when you start to look at this in a more structural way, you start to see things like a bioregional learning center doesn't have to be a center, although you do need coordination, because there's actually a lot of decentralization that's implied. It's spread out across the landscape. But if you have a learning center that's maintaining the flaw of Western philosophy, the flaw of mind-body dualism, the flaw that you study things separately from doing things, then you're never going to get anywhere. So you actually need a portfolio of projects, which is regenerative efforts and activities in the community brought into a tapestry of relationships with each other, and that you coordinate the learning to spread best practices, and that you can start to create things like community foundations or service leadership, ways of mobilizing resources within your community. I don't know if you all know this, that community foundations, their purpose, because you guys have one, you have the Toronto Foundation, right? The first one ever was the Cleveland Foundation. They've been around for about 100 years. But the idea was, instead of the philanthropist deciding where the money goes, you actually bring different multi-actor networks of people, convene them into alliances, and help them mobilize resources among each other. That's called a local economy. And so you need some kinds of coordinating mechanisms for building a local economy. You need to organize the existing projects that are already happening, as well as birth new ones to create integration and coherence. And that is a whole bunch of learning. So you need bioregional learning centers to coordinate it and to share it. And so this way of being is the model for economic development into the future. It's the way that we create the economies to come, is that we deglobalize, we relocalize. Now, that doesn't mean that the globe goes away. It's just that we rebalance the relationship. Right now, we have this thing called capital flight, which is anyone with money can destroy any resource on Earth at any time by moving across all the borders, using money to buy politicians and capture institutions to do it. That's called neoliberal capitalism. It's a beautiful death sentence. What if instead we have regional councils that hold the sovereignty of their place and they say, damn it, this water's sacred, you cannot destroy it. And they build autonomy and regional sovereignty around what is the basis of their survival. Doesn't that sound like indigenous cultures? It should, except reorganized with a planetary context, which is the part that's new. And so that means that we need to have bioregional learning centers help us weave tapestries of projects like this building and like this York Reforestation Project, right? There are projects, there are activities already existing, isolated and fragmented from each other all across your region. So you weave a tapestry of projects. Organize them around the natural organizing patterns of your landscape, such as the Oak Ridges moraine, or the watersheds themselves, or other patterns like the alluvial plains, which give you the sediments that give you agriculture, on and on. You organize around the patterns of the landscapes. There's a deep learning of people in place, of both. To learn a people, you have to know where they are from. To know a place, you have to know who peoples it. Indigenous cultures don't separate humans from the rest of life, so they're all people. The river can be people, the mountains can be people, the butterflies can be people, because they're all part of the intelligence of the place and the way that you can relate. So the deep learning of people in place is a big part of how this works. And then you reconstruct and you celebrate and protect the memory of the cultural and ecological history of place. For example, how did the Great Lakes form? How did the Oak Ridges moraine form? Why is it here? The people who lived here before the settler culture, how did they live? How did they organize their lives? What might we learn from them? Those of them who are still here, how might we restore healthy relationships? History tells us how to relate now to know how to be in the future. And then we also have to have scenarios and agendas and visions for present and future change. Notice I say present and future together, because the future is always an emerging present. And the present is an ephemeral emerging future. And so we're in a time of profound and unprecedented change, and we have to move with intention into the future, which we don't even know how to do unless we do it together, because each of us holds different kinds of knowledge about our place. And that means we need to cultivate shared vision and collective action. We have to cultivate the ability to do what happened with the Don River restoration in downtown Toronto, the organizing of the restoration of an entire watershed. You guys, if you all don't know about that, go learn about it and be proud. Do you know how frequently dead rivers are brought back to life in major urban areas? It's pretty damn awesome. And we got to see it in the dead of winter. It's still awesome. Standing there freezing on that pedestal thing, it's still amazing. So yeah, this shared vision and collective action includes celebrating what you're already doing well, to learn that you're not starting anything from scratch. You have a lot of stuff in motion. And this is so important. The indigenous is all of us. 100% of humanity evolved from indigenous human ancestors. We're all descendants of indigenous people. We all can be indigenous again. My ancestors are indigenous and so are yours. Just my ancestors were wiped out by someone else's cultural genocide, so I don't remember them. But I'm human, so I know from the reconstruction of history that 99% of the time my ancestors were indigenous, and before that they were endogenous, which means they were embedded within the life system of the earth going back 3.5 billion years, because we're part of this planet. So this idea of indigenous land connection goes all the way out to the Big Bang. It goes all the way out to how can our planet have life on it. You can take this to really beautiful, deep questions. And it also means bringing indigenous knowledge together with the best of science and modernity, understood through a regenerative lens. The best of science and modernity is that which tells us how life works on this planet and tells us how to be in harmony with life. And my goodness, do we know a lot. It's sort of incredible. Collectively, we're behaving pretty stupidly for such a smart species. We actually know a lot. And so this just brings me to a little brief survey of another place that's doing it, to say, y'all don't have to do this on your own. I'm down in the turn of the northern Andes. This is Colombia. And this is the region where I live. This is 500,000 hectares of land. We live right about there in Barichara, Colombia. We're in a unique ecosystem called a tropical dry forest, but it's actually the only tropical dry forest that's got a high Andes interaction. So 8 out of 10 species are endemic. And unfortunately, about 95% of that forest has been destroyed for monoculture agriculture. So it's becoming a desert. So we're in a post-collapse landscape, or is already destroyed. But isn't it pretty? That's Barichara. Its tourism slogan is the prettiest little town in Colombia. It's probably accurate. It's really pretty there. This is a picture taken from Bioparque Moncora, which is a community reforestation project and a place where the kids from the public schools come to learn the native ecology and at the same time to grow a forest. And we have syntropic agroforestry, and we have other projects embedded in this space where they're learning how to build an economy through reforestation. And so just want to say everything I'm talking about is not theoretical. We're actually doing it. And people in other places are doing it too. And so the idea for Barichara, just like here, is that there are all these existing projects and they're already somewhere in the landscape. So the idea was to create a design school whose focus was to heal the landscape. All of the dead rivers in this desert landscape that had water flowing in them 25 years ago. We have kids that are like 20 years old that would swim in the streams that are dry now, and they remember. We have old men and women in their 80s and 90s that remember the monkeys that were there. They remember when the jaguars were there. And now there are almost no mammals because they cut down the whole forest. But within living memory, it changed so fast that we're grabbing it. Part of education is the young people interviewing the old people about what was this stream like when you were a kid? What happened to this forest? And people weep because they're so ashamed to look the children in the eyes and say, we did this. It didn't just happen on my watch, it happened with my hands. I helped cut down this forest to grow tobacco for the British Tobacco Company, and then afterwards, on these steep incline slopes, erosion took the rest away. And so we're restoring that by letting the children lead. This is a project called Pasos de Agua, which is Spanish for the steps of water. What happens is the children walk the dry stream beds of the dead rivers, and they interview the landowners who own that land, and they ask them what happened to the water. And you ignite a spark of consciousness in the adults. The kids already had it. And then you bring in indigenous elders like this Muisca man who comes and talks to the children about right relationship with their landscapes. Because in Colombia, there's still a lot of indigenous people around. There's still a lot of indigenous people around here. And so this kind of multi-generational relationship embedded in a landscape, organized around restoration, connected to a fundamental focus of sacred land connection, is transforming the whole territory. And so then these kids also create their own policies and their own solutions. This is Quetzal. She just turned 7 last week. She was 6.5 when this picture was taken. And these kids are presenting their ideas for how to restore the dead watershed of the Barichara River. And they're saying things like, I was watching this YouTube video where you could make this hay bale and put mushrooms in it and it'd become a biofilter. And I'm like, that kid's 7. Yay, YouTube. So you can just see education is so different. It's so different. And by the way, these kids started this project because we were doing a community philanthropy experiment. We wanted to see if the adults would donate money to each other's projects within the community, which Colombians don't really know what philanthropy is after 500 years of colonialism. And last century, they had a huge period of extended violence. So they don't really know about philanthropy. Getting them to support each other's projects is a big transformation of culture. And in the middle of this big event, a 6-year-old kid asks for the microphone and says, I want to be able to fish in the river. But I can't do that because the water that's there is too contaminated and all the streams are dried up. And so we immediately started raising money for the 6-year-old. It wasn't even on the agenda. And next thing you know, they're organizing across the landscape, creating their own policy frameworks. And do you know why they can do it? Because of people like Milena right here. If the adults don't take the kids seriously, the kids will give up on the adults. But when the kids have a good idea, the adults respond, it changes everything. It changes everything. And so this is one of the really powerful patterns of how we're driving regeneration in our region, is putting the children in the center of the process. And then we have things like this, grandmother Gabriela and her granddaughter Soraya. It's very common that when we have a meeting of adults to talk about important matters, that the children are playing among us. Because we want the children. Soraya was 4 years old in this picture. She's 6 now. We want the children to remember what their parents talked about when they were little. Because we know what's coming. And we know that those kids need to know we're taking this seriously. And so we have the children and the elders together every chance we get. And by the way, you can't have a serious conversation about a dead river. You can't have it without children laughing and playing around you to remind you of the innocence of humanity. And they are such healing elixir. And so we always place the children in the middle of the process, but then we can do interesting things. Like we can send the big kids off on a mission and the little kids can be their mentors. And we cultivate civic leadership from small child to bigger child. So there's so many ways we can reimagine education in service to our local communities and our local landscapes. This is my daughter. That's Elise. This is our friend Oswaldo. This is a piece of land we bought with crowdfunding money back in 2020, project called Orienting del Agua, completely degraded land that we're turning back into native forest. And there's a school, a little campesino country school, right on the edge of the nature reserve. So for 2 years, we were doing reforestation work and the teacher wouldn't bring the kids. Then we built this structure with some shade because it's pretty hot in the tropics without any shade. And there's no forest left. And then once we had a shaded spot, we could start working. And we're teaching the children syntropic agroforestry and native ecology and reforestation on the boundary of their school that they can walk to. So you can co-locate these kinds of cultural, ecological learning and landscape restoration processes, co-locate them with your schools. And so this is something that we're doing in Barichara. And then, of course, the kids are leading the way. They decided they wanted to do a protest march and a dance party. They're kids. We had some pretty awesome DJs. And so you can see, to care for the water is to care for your life. The kids practiced art. They practiced public speaking. They became DJs and figured out music. They learned how to dance. They're just having fun. And you know, the adults are a little bit embarrassed that the kids are better at this than they are. And so what's really powerful about this image for me is that this was what the kids wanted to do. It wasn't the adults getting the kids all upset and doing a protest. Kids were like, let's do a protest, but let's do it the kid way, which is we're gonna like play music and have fun and draw pretty pictures, gotta do some coloring, right? And so it was like this huge social cohesion experience of everyone coming together. And I gotta say, we danced our butts off during the DJ part. It was really fun. And so, that's Elise again, that's my daughter, pretty happy. This is a picture that I took when we were in Mexicali, Mexico, where the Colorado River no longer goes to the sea. So the question is, how do we prepare the children now for what's coming in the years ahead, knowing that what's happening at a planetary scale is absolutely destabilizing and already in process, and that our salvation, if there is salvation, is how we organize locally. and how we reconnect to our landscapes. And so that's my little provocation to bring us into conversation today about education in the Greater Tkaronto Bioregion. Thank you very much. When humans move evolution from the selection of an individual's power to the power of the group to establish its norms, which is something humans do like no other animal. Human social norms are unlike any other animal's way of managing its behavior. That what we do is we go through what's called an evolutionary transition. We go to a higher level of organization. So human ability to form groups that are collaborative is one of the greatest innovations in the history of evolution. Humans are incredible cooperators at the group level, which means power is always implicated, because in that dynamic of individual relative to group, there are power dynamics. And then you have groups within groups that can go up and down and become even more complex. So the key to this becomes to recognize certain things. One is a lot of our power comes from our imagination. What I mean is our ability to imagine changes what our sense of power is. Like if we think of money as just nothing more than energy and a tool, then we see how the energy can be destructive or it can be creative. And then we start to set intentions around how to use it. Just like a hammer could kill someone or it could build a house. You start to think of it in a different way. And the way you imagine it changes things. One of the most powerful things I've found is to introduce the ability to dream differently. I'll give a really concrete example. Back in June, Penny and I, with our partner Benji, drove from the headwaters of the Colorado Basin down to the Sea of Cortez, traveling through towns, talking about an impossible idea. Can we regenerate the Colorado River? The entire discourse ignores the idea of regenerating the river. It comes up nowhere. No one could imagine it. And then the first 15 minutes, Benji would sit in the back and watch everyone's faces as I'd give a talk. First 15 minutes, everyone's credulous. Like, who is this crazy guy with this stupid idea that thinks we can regenerate the Colorado River? And then 20 minutes later, they're like, we can organize our town and we can work with the neighboring town and this is possible. Because we changed the capacity to imagine. And we changed it by just showing them how they're already organized as a landscape by the way the water moves. And showing that they could have conversations and have stories of their place in a different way. And that each town is connected to other towns by the way the water moves. And that these different branches of rivers that run into one river system. And so the power of imagination completely changes the power dynamic. And so that's what's so interesting about this moment, is that we're in a moment where so many of our stories are breaking down, that whoever tells the better story, not who individually, but whichever cultural subgroup tells the better story, is the group that brings the power into being. Because power, in terms of physics, power is the ability to have energy do work, which means energy changes the physical distribution of the world. So if you think of power in that way, the ability to do something or not do something, what was really interesting to me was when we were near Aspen, Colorado, the richest town in all of the United States, no one had enough money to do anything. The richest place in the United States, no one had enough money to do anything. When we were in Mexicali with the drug lords and the mafia bosses, they could transform their whole community because the whole city is like 50 years old and they invented it. And they're like, we can invent a different city. And the mindset and the ability to imagine was so fundamentally different that the people of Mexicali are bringing money to Colorado to support regenerative projects while the rich people are being idiots because they don't have any ability to imagine. Money is irrelevant in this situation. It's the ability to imagine and mobilize energy. And the most important energy in that context was inspiration. Who can inspire action? Who can inspire cooperation? So I think the question about power is very real and also so distorted right now that there are deep opportunities to reframe it. And so that doesn't deny the existence of the power structures that are, but they are so cancerous, they're killing themselves. They're going away. They're not going to be around for much longer. But this other kind of power, the power to imagine a different way of being, is so enticing, it's so erotic, it's so seductive, that we should start testing it. We should start testing our power and seeing just how seductive it could be. because it's much more powerful than having money and having a big house and having false security, which we now know is false. And so I think that power is always present, but our way to transform power is to change group dynamics. And the best way to do that is with small groups. And then the real power is in our ability to imagine. Our ability to dream is our most powerful ability. I would say the key concept here is integrity, more than psychological safety, which is not to say you scared them. It's that I would lean into the danger of truth rather than hide truth and then be accountable for basically lying with it, which is what most of our climate discourse has been for the last 30 years. And I would say that the most empowering thing that young people can see is adults being responsible for what's happening. And what's beautiful about opening the conversation to where the truth is, like how far into the danger zone we are, is that we start to release the stress of holding our fear, because we're together holding what's real. And when we start to move into actions together, it is so profoundly healing. So what I found in my own history of grappling with climate anxiety and the ecological crisis was I was carrying this huge burden because I was afraid of a future that was already here. It wasn't even in the future, it was already here. And once I realized that and came to acceptance about it, I was able to let it go. Just didn't have to carry it anymore. And then I was able to communicate from a really different place, a place of love. And so I found I couldn't fully speak from love when I was not speaking from my heart what was true. But when I could speak from my heart what was true, I would find it would be deeply inspiring. And that's been my experience. When I give talks about planetary collapse, people come away inspired. And it's not because I scared them into it, it's they already knew. They're like, God, I'm glad someone finally just said it out loud. It's like we've all sort of known this, and the difference is, I think, that with the details about, like I'm trained in Earth system science, so the details about how the planet works, we actually see lots of ways to restore these functions. And so, like as an example, right now there's this huge crisis with water allocation in the Colorado Basin. They allocated too much water back in the 1940s, and ever since they've been allocating too much water, more water than there actually is in the river system. And so lots of people are really fixated on the scarcity. How much water do I get? How much water do I get? But if you actually understand hydrology, the amount of water is much less important than the frequency of the water cycle. Which is, if you restore vegetation, you would restore the small water cycle, and you'd have evapotranspiration processes with the forest, and the same amount of water would do 10 to 20 times as much good. And the amount of water is less important than its flow. And so this shift from scarcity and quantity to health and circulation is a shift of understanding. It's like, oh, now I understand how landscapes, like deserts are not the absence of rain. Deserts are the absence of evapotranspiration continuing to bring the water that restores the water cycle. Deserts come after you've destroyed the forest. Deserts end and rain returns when you restore the forest. And it's because of the water cycle. And so that's what's so powerful about this is when you start going into, well, why is it all breaking down? Oh, here and here and here, this is where it's breaking down. Because this is how it works. Oh, now I can see how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But if we pretend that it's not the way that it really is, if we don't talk about how it really is, then we can't work with how it really is. And then we can't actually do anything empowering because we can't see the consequences. And so that's what's so sort of paradoxical about this, is by speaking the truth in a more blunt manner, it opens us up to the reality of how to act in integrity. And integrity is really the key. So be kind and be compassionate, but also be honest, is the way to find that balance. And we're also not going to stop people from feeling anxiety. Do you feel like there's still anxiety, right? It doesn't go away, but it's running together. And we see things we can do. So I would like to see young people saying, well, not only do I see that the adults are admitting what I'm afraid of, but they're actually giving us context to work together. Because that's the other piece that really quickly comes forth is there's no way to address this on our own. But addressing it together is much easier than we think. It's just that we haven't had those conversations yet to show that, oh, we actually have to work at the level of the whole watershed. All right, well, that sounds like a lot, but maybe that's doable. There are 5 watersheds that go through the city of Toronto. The watersheds aren't that big. You know, in the grand scheme of things, you can organize them. And so, and people have, which is the other thing. So I would say the real challenge is coming to a place of acceptance in ourselves, where we can speak from that place of truth with kindness. Because what happens is when you're speaking from fear and you haven't come to full acceptance, there's anger, there's resentment, there's judgment, there's probably no compassion. And so it's really hard to not judge from that place. It's just a stage of grieving process. But when you get to a later stage of acceptance, it's like, okay, serious issues, but serious responsibility, and real things we can do. And those real things we can do, the greenwashing just becomes really ineffective. So I go, telling me to change my light bulbs isn't going to fix the hydrological cycle, but reforestation could. And you start to see that you shift your priorities to things that will actually work. And that's where a lot of the real healing happens. So, it's a really big issue. And there are considerations for particular histories of abuse and trauma that have exceptions, but in general, I would say act with integrity. I think, for one thing, there's a really beautiful movement in unlearning, unschooling, deschooling that goes back quite a while. And there's also a very strong documented history of how much education has been cultural genocide. Just thinking of the residential schools and their equivalents. And then, you know, to educate someone is to basically civilize them, but it has a particular meaning. And I think a lot of this is actually about getting below that, which means there's a lot of decolonization of education that's strongly, strongly implied here. And I also see this as deeply rehumanizing, because the machine metaphors are abundant in education. For those of you who don't know the cognitive linguistics discourse on education, there are 2 primary metaphors for education. There's the factory education model, and then there's the garden model, and they have very different language. So you think of, you know, students as widgets, and efficiency measures and all that's all within the machine metaphor of the factory model. Whereas looking at flourishing and well-being and relationship and things that are more about human development and a living systems framework. So there are lots of ways that the words are, I think, are stigmatizing for good reason, for historical reason. And what's more important is for us to get under them and clarify those value systems, which is part of the re-envisioning of education is the changing of those value systems. So I think it's truly important work. The key is to slow down and connect, is that kids are taught from a very young age that they're supposed to have their place and they're supposed to do what they're told, and there's this whole set of historical baggage. But when you go into a place of what's really going on with your feelings, how are you really doing, and have real listening and real connection, and then the opportunity to express, and then through that expression starting to feel a sense of creative empowerment, one thing that very quickly happens is the ignition of passion. And so what we need for young people is to find their own passion. As Bill Plotkin, who does a lot of nature education work, calls it soul work. He says the soul, in his definition, is you are unique in the universe, in all of the history of life. You are alive in this moment with something to bring into being, that is your deep purpose in this moment, and that is your soul work. And so I think helping young people to find that will shift everything about education. In the way that you're saying, that it actually becomes something that we might not even use the word education, we might not even talk about school, and if the language is triggering, to just step aside from it. But I think the way to get to the urgency is to see how much our inner worlds have been diminished by just going silent. And that what we have to learn how to do is to learn how to speak, or to express our voice, or to give our being in ourselves needs to be expressed. And when we start to do that, we find what young people really love and what they really care about, which is usually where the taboo is, what they're afraid to express. Because they're afraid of not being accepted, or afraid of not being heard, or afraid of it being hurt, and creating those spaces for that really deep personal empowerment. And then around that, creative art projects, which can bring in science and other things too, but creative art projects where they can practice expressing themselves in a relational context of their community. to bring what they care about to the community. And then the urgency will come out as they open up their feelings. Because at a most basic level, organisms are sensing patterns. Your body senses, it feels. And so when you feel hurt or you feel afraid, you withdraw and you close off. And we see a lot of young people close off. And then they distract and go into all kinds of weird, stupid things because it's a distraction. It's just like, who cares? It's pointless. So they just go into a distraction. But once they start to open up, it's like you have to create a space for that fire to shine. And that's where there's a huge role for educational support or community social support. And so this is like the urgency is in the muting of our souls. The urgency is in the silencing of our hearts. And the awakening is to feel. And then as we feel, we start to build capacity to feel. And so I think the urgency is there in every one of them through their inaction and their apathy. But the apathy is the illusion. The reality is it hurts too much to feel. And so I think that the whole idea of trying to persuade someone, like, you've got to take action on climate, or it's like, that's the wrong way around. It's instead go into their place of intimacy with them. So you need the right kind of trust to do that. And the right person, not just anyone's going to be able to do that. It might just be peer supports for their friends. But however it happens, for them to express themselves to someone and to be seen. And then from that place, to start to share what they really care about. And then have the learning supports around, well, if that's what you care about, I can help you, or we can help you to learn more about it and to take action on it. And so I think there's a huge opportunity around the construction or the scaffolding of that support, but centered around the opening of hearts. That's the place where we've all gone silent. So yeah, that's what I would say. That's where the real urgency is. Because the biggest risk is going to be depression, suicide, checking out. And what you want is leaning in. So the real emergency is in the place where everything is quiet.
This is a new poster that we've just created as part of the 7th Generation GTB Bioregional Learning Center. And it's a piece of artwork called Earth Dance, created by BC community artist Claire Atwell. And it's from Joe Brewer's book, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. And the message is simple, but I think really important. The vital work is to regenerate. And not just regenerate a small piece, but to regenerate the entire earth. There's a quote from Joe on the poster, and it says, regenerative design can bring a river back to life. It can restore the health and vitality of an individual and their family. It can transform grief and trauma into vital pathways of healing for people, community, and ecosystems. Regenerate life, affirm life. All we have is each other and the land and the power of story. So at the heart of the 7th Generation GTB work is #change the story. Change the story of how we live with each other on a changing planet. How do we start to do that? By growing a tree of life. And this is our 7th Generation GTB Tree of Life. We've been working with a visual storyteller, Patricia, here in Toronto, to create an image that kind of evokes all the dimensions of the multi-layered systems complexity in the 7th Generation GTB work. And we're kind of unveiling it right here for you today. This is kind of the first time we're going public with it. And this is a very complex tree because the story isn't simple. It can't be simple when we find ourselves in a wickedly complex global predicament. We are doing a complex earth dance between mitigating where we can, adapting to an ever-changing reality, and then planting important seeds for something new, that tree of life. The tree, of course, is one of the most used symbols around the world culturally. And we were recently talking to an older gentleman who had worked in NGOs, traveled around the world, and he commented that in other cultures, generations just naturally gather under a tree, they talk to each other, they talk about community issues. So through 7th Generation GTB, we're trying to kind of create a metaphorical tree so that Generations can get together and explore the things that matter in lifetimes across generations. In really practical terms, the imagery of this tree of life takes shape as working to create parallel systems of structures and processes for both social and ecological regeneration. Hopefully, we can provide some sanctuary for folks now, and over the long term, this can become more deeply and broadly rooted. The North Star in all of this, which in this case is actually the life-giving star of the sun, is eco-psychosocial well-being. What that means is ecological integrity, personal wholeness, social coherence in the context of lifetimes across generations. The idea is I can't be okay if the land's not okay, if the community's not okay, now and into the future. So we're talking about systemic well-being in a healthy society with a healthy story that comes from all things being in right relationship over the long term. So let's go to the bottom of the tree. There's a rich multi-layered meaning to our use of the word seven generation. It's certainly rooted in the Indigenous concept of a holistic long-term thinking across seven generations. It draws on the teachings of the seven grandfathers to help orient values. At the same time, seven generation reflects the modern context of a historic demographic shift to more living generations. For the first time in history, as more people live longer, you can personally know through your lifetime, in your family and in your community, seven generations. Your own, three before you, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and then three after you, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. There is comfort and insight and power in this ability to connect more generations than ever before. This intergenerational dynamic is really key. And by strategically connecting generations, we can improve their mutual well-being right now, while also sparking far-reaching community impact. And the thing that I like about youth and elders is because they're not as entrenched in the status quo, they're more able to speak truth and remind us what really matters. So seven generation GTB is about people and place. This is kind of the middle of the tree. And it's about two things at the same time on both sides of the tree trunk. Social regeneration, generations in community, bringing them together for mutual support, a longer perspective, collective action. Also, ecological regeneration. It's about building community and regenerative practices across the local bioregion. And you can see what is our legacy at this pivotal moment. This is like a really big legacy project. This is our legacy project. What are we going to do that will help the continuation of life? And this is a legacy project that will take place over the next 10 years, over the next 100 years, over the next 500 years. This is not a short-term simple fix. On the social regeneration side, sharing stories is really important, especially across generations. On the ecological regeneration side, we have a land circle forming. The land circle involves bringing together all kinds of public and private large landscapes, including farms, forests, for both regeneration and embodied learning. Just last week, we connected with an organization that's been doing native planting in backyards for about 15 years. They have relationships with all the local municipalities, and we're exploring ways that their model might be expanded to reach the entire GTB with the idea that every backyard, every schoolyard reflects and connects into the bioregion. Now, that you see the middle of the trunk of the tree there in the middle of the diagram. This connection from what's going on in a plot of land to the bioregion is really important. The fractal scaling is something that's critical in this work. A lot of times projects talk about scaling up. Scaling up isn't as important as scale linking, doing the right thing at each level so that it connects properly to the level above and below it. So understanding how your plot of land and the community projects on that land connects into the bioregion. and then how the bioregion connects into the Great Lakes Basin and ultimately into the planet. That gives everything more meaningful long-term impact. The bioregion, as far as I can see from the research that we've done, is the difference that makes a difference. Drawing on Earth system science, a bioregion is the smallest actionable scale reflecting bigger planetary processes. So you want everything to feed into and out of that. So now we go to the top of the tree, and this becomes very much a game of connect the dots. This is the top of our tree. 7th generation GTB connects across 7 broad themes: environment and climate change, economy, community, health, education, life course and aging, indigenous worldviews and knowledge. And what we're doing is we're creating a kind of nest in the tree to bring together and nurture action. All of those dots are interwoven and interconnected, and they're kind of a nest in the tree. And the flows around the nest are like flows of water, like the winds of change. Clouds, of course, are water in the air. So we have what all this represents at the top of the tree is all the structures and processes we're trying to put into place in a practical sense. So you look at the tree and you see a lot of systems complexity. You see the social regeneration going hand in hand with the ecological regeneration, because I think that that's something that it's become evident that you need both of at the same time.